The winter air inside my tiny third-floor studio apartment didn't just feel cold, it felt deliberately punitive. For the past 3 weeks, the radiator had done nothing but emit a low, rhythmic metallic knocking, a hollow ticking sound that reminded me of a countdown clock. The landlord, a man who happened to owe his entire property management portfolio to the financing goodwill of Sterling Enterprises, had suddenly become entirely unreachable. Every phone call went straight to a generic voicemail box. Every formal email template was met with a bounced automated notification. I knew exactly whose hand was adjusting the thermostat of my life. It wasn't an administrative oversight. It was an orchestrated squeeze. I stood over my cluttered kitchen counter, wrapping my freezing fingers around a mug of lukewarm tap water, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The blue light reflected off the layers of thick wool sweaters I had been forced to pile on just to keep my hands steady enough to type. Scattered across the cracked laminate surface were printouts of municipal zoning laws, hidden corporate bylaws, and old, dust-covered ledgers from my late grandmother's estate. For the past 5 years, my parents, Arthur and Beatrice Sterling, had masterfully cultivated a public narrative that I was an ungrateful, unstable burden. To the high society circles of Oakridge, I was the tragic, lazy daughter who refused to utilize the immense privileges of her birthright. They whispered it at country club brunches. They sighed it softly to local business owners over charity golf tournaments. The consequence was absolute and immediate. I was completely blacklisted. Every single resume I submitted within a 50-mile radius was met with polite, immediate rejection. Local shopkeepers who had known me since childhood would suddenly look at the floor when I walked in, murmuring that they just didn't have the hours available. The trap was elegantly simple. Keep me entirely broke, completely isolated and socially ruined so that I would have no choice but to rely on them for my very survival. They wanted me on my knees, begging for the meager, under-the-table administrative crumbs they threw my way, ensuring I would never possess the financial independence or the public credibility to question how they ran the family empire. But 3 nights ago, the nature of the trap had fundamentally changed. Arthur had called me into the grand, mahogany-panelled library of the Sterling Manor. He didn't look at me when I entered. He merely slid a massive encrypted external hard drive across the polished desk. The corporate compliance audit for our upcoming commercial expansion needs a complete digital overhaul before the annual gala, he had said, his voice flat, aristocratic, and completely devoid of paternal warmth. The primary servers are experiencing data bottlenecks. Fix the system architecture, cross-reference the digital signatures, and do it quietly. If you finish it by the end of the week, I might consider authorizing your landlord to finally fix your heating. Consider it an opportunity to finally contribute something of value to this family. They thought they were assigning me a mindless, grueling data entry chore to prove my subservience. They thought that because they had successfully crushed my spirit, they had also blinded my intellect. What they completely forgot, in their profound, blinding arrogance, was that before my father had fully aligned himself with my mother's ruthless corporate ambitions, he had insisted I receive a top-tier education in forensic accounting and network systems engineering. They viewed technology as a utility to be manipulated. I viewed it as a transparent ledger of human behavior. For 72 straight hours, while the frost slowly patterned the windows of my freezing apartment, my fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed their superficial security firewalls, utilizing a master administrative decryption key I had quietly extracted from their outdated server legacy archives years ago. I didn't just organize their shipping manifests and real estate listings. I tore through the hidden, multi-layered digital architecture of Sterling Development Group. And there, buried beneath a dense labyrinth of shell corporations, falsified tax exemptions, and intentionally mislabeled digital routing paths, I found the smoking gun. They weren't just cruel, high-society tyrants. They were white-collar criminals on an unimaginable scale. Over the last 60 months, Arthur and Beatrice had systematically siphoned millions of dollars from public infrastructure funds, deliberately falsified safety documents for local schools, and most horrifyingly, used forged power of attorney documents to completely drain the multi-million-dollar trust fund my grandmother had explicitly left to me. They had used my stolen identity as a legal shield, routing their most toxic, legally radioactive land acquisitions through a dummy corporation that bore my forged electronic signature. If the federal authorities ever caught on, the paper trail was meticulously designed to stop exactly at my doorstep. I was their ultimate contingency plan. I was their designated scapegoat. I stared at the split-screen comparison on my monitor. My personal bank account balance showing a pathetic $142, juxtaposed against a wire transfer receipt showing $6.8 million, exiting a public fund and sliding into a private asset account in the Cayman Islands under a forged digital clone of my handwriting. A profound, absolute wave of icy calm washed over me. The exhaustion vanished. The lingering, childhood desire for their approval died a swift, unceremonious death in the dark. I didn't call the police. I didn't send a frantic, emotional text message confronting them. That would allow them to call their expensive crisis management attorneys, bury the files, and spin the narrative once again. No, they had chosen a public stage to destroy me over a lifetime. I would choose their absolute highest public platform to dismantle them. I spent the next 24 hours writing a specialized, automated network injection script. I knew the technical specifications of the Oak Ridge local news broadcasting studio perfectly. I had set up their secondary server racks as an unpaid intern years ago. "Tonight is the night," I whispered to the empty, freezing room as I wrapped my coat tightly around my shoulders, slipping my phone into my pocket. "You wanted the town to see me, Mother. I'm going to make sure they see all of us." The backstage corridor of the Oak Ridge television studio was a chaotic blur of high-strung production assistants, clipboards, and heavy rolling equipment cases. The air smelled strongly of industrial floor cleaner, ozone from the massive lighting grids, and the distinct, cloying scent of expensive floral perfume. I walked through the security doors unchallenged, the laminated corporate audit badge I still wore around my neck acting as an invisible pass. "Makeup needs a touch-up on camera too," a frantic voice yelled from down the hall. I stepped into the main studio parlor, a cavernous room painted entirely in matte black to absorb the light. In the center of the floor stood the grand set for the annual Oak Ridge Citizen of the Year broadcast. It was a masterpiece of local television opulence, a raised plexiglass stage, crisp high-definition projection backdrops, and a massive mahogany anchor desk polished to a mirror shine. Sitting front and center in the VIP audience section were the town's absolute elite: the mayor, members of the city council, wealthy real estate investors, and the private school board directors. Everyone who mattered in Oak Ridge was in this room, dressed in tailored suits and silk evening gowns, all eagerly awaiting the arrival of their golden couple. And then the double doors at the back of the studio swung open. Arthur and Beatrice Sterling walked in like royalty, reviewing their subjects. My mother wore an immaculate, custom-tailored, cream-colored designer suit that practically glowed under the dim studio transition lights. Around her neck sat a heavy diamond tennis necklace, its facets catching the light with every sharp, calculated turn of her head. Her hair was styled into a flawless, unyielding barb. Her smile was wide, bright, and perfectly symmetrical, the result of decades of practiced public relations. Arthur walked half a step behind her, exuding an air of supreme, aristocratic confidence in a bespoke navy suit, his chest puffed out, a heavy gold watch glinting on his wrist. The crowd in the VIP section immediately erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. People leaned across the velvet ropes just to catch their eyes, nodding desperately in hopes of securing a future real estate favor or a tax-deductible invitation to their summer estate. Beatrice's eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze tracking past the mayor, past the local bank executives, until her sharp, cold eyes locked directly onto me sitting quietly in the very front row of the audience. Her smile didn't falter for a single second, but her eyes narrowed into two slivers of pure, predatory satisfaction. She leaned slightly toward Arthur, whispering something behind her manicured hand. Arthur looked over, a brief, marking smirk crossing his aristocratic features before he assumed his mask of noble solemnity. They had deliberately demanded my presence tonight. They wanted me to sit in the front row, wrapped in my cheap, worn-out winter coat, acting as the perfect physical contrast to their glittering perfection. I was there to be the shadow that made their light look brighter. 60 seconds to air, positions everyone, the floor manager bellowed, his voice echoing through the high rafters of the studio. My parents stepped up onto the plexiglass platform, their movements perfectly synchronized as they took their seats opposite the veteran news anchor, a man whose career had been heavily funded by sterling corporate advertisements. The anchor gave them a warm, obsequious nod, adjusting his earpiece. "Audio check for camera 1, a technician called out. "Testing 1, 2, Arthur's booming, trustworthy voice resonated through the studio speakers. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms, a voice that had convinced hundreds of local families to trust Sterling Enterprises with their life savings. I quietly reached into my coat pocket. My fingers grazed the cool metallic edge of my smartphone. My heart wasn't racing. My breathing was perfectly rhythmic. I opened my custom terminal app. The script was compiled, the digital payload sitting directly on the edge of the station's primary satellite uplink directory, waiting for a single command override. 3-2, the floor manager signaled silently, dropping his hand and pointing a rigid finger at camera 1. The glowing red, live, light on top of the primary studio camera flickered to life, burning like a drop of fresh blood in the darkness of the set. The broadcast was officially streaming into every home, every restaurant, every crowded sports bar, and every local business across the entire county. "Good evening, Oakridge," the anchor began, his voice dropping into his professional broadcasting cadence. "Tonight, we honor two individuals who embody the very spirit, integrity, and generosity of our great community. A couple whose recent multi-million-dollar philanthropic donation to the Oakridge Children's Hospital will ensure a brighter, safer future for generations to come. Parents, visionaries, and citizens of the year, Arthur and Beatrice Sterling." The mechanical applause sign flashed bright green, and the audience behind me clapped with desperate devotion. On stage, Beatrice leaned toward her lapel microphone, her eyes locked perfectly onto camera 2. The camera she knew was feeding the live close-up shots directly to the local television sets. The trap was sprung, but for the first time in my life I wasn't the one caught inside it. "Thank you everyone," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a perfectly modulated octave of practiced maternal sorrow. She squeezed her eyes shut for a brief fraction of a second, summoning a masterful, tragic hint of unshed tears that would have won an award on any dramatic stage. "Arthur and I are so deeply blessed to be able to give back to the children of this beautiful town. Truly, our only real regret tonight, our only true heartbreak on this joyous occasion, is that our own daughter Maya couldn't find it in her heart to follow in our footsteps." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the live broadcast. She looked directly down the lens of the camera, ensuring every single viewer at home could see the profound, fake grief etched into her features. "It is a heavy, heartbreaking burden when your only child turns out to be a complete disappointment," she continued, her voice trembling slightly with manufactured emotion. "Refusing to work, abandoning our sacred family values, and choosing to live off the scraps of our hard work while contributing absolutely nothing to the community that raised her. We brought her here tonight in hopes that seeing this charity would spark something within her soul, but alas." Arthur nodded solemnly beside her, his face a mask of grieving, noble fatherhood as he reached over to gently pat her hand. "We pray every single day that she finally finds her way," he added, his booming, trustworthy voice echoing through the studio speakers and into the soundproofed corners of the room. "But some people simply choose to be a permanent blight on their family's name and a drain on society." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the studio audience behind me. The heavy, suffocating silence of public judgment fell over the room like a shroud. I could feel the physical weight of dozens of eyes shifting away from the stage, turning in their seats to lock onto me sitting alone in the front row. The whispers started instantly, a low, buzzing, venomous hiss of social condemnation. "How could she do that to them?" a woman whispered 3 rows back. "After everything they've given her," a man murmured, shaking his head in disgust. They thought they had won. They thought this public execution would be the final nail in the coffin of my credibility, ensuring that if I ever tried to bring my financial evidence to light, the entire town would already view me as a bitter, lazy, unstable liar seeking revenge against her saintly parents. I stood up slowly. I didn't cry, my hands remained perfectly steady. I didn't scream, I didn't yell, and I didn't make a scene. I simply stood there in the blinding glare of the studio lights, pulled my phone from my pocket, and tapped the glowing blue icon in the center of my screen. "Execute." In the master control room behind the glass partition, the main digital switchboard suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. The automated override script initiated instantly, severing the studio's manual control over the live broadcast feed. The technical director frantically began slamming his hands onto the physical layout board, trying to cut to a commercial break, but the administrative lock protocol held completely firm. The system was entirely mine. Across the entire town of Oakridge, in the living rooms of families eating dinner, on the giant screens of the crowded local bars, On the tablets of commuters, the polished, high-definition faces of Arthur and Beatrice Sterling suddenly dissolved into static. The screens flipped to a stark, blinding white background, replaced by a rapidly scrolling, forensic ledger of raw financial data, bank wire receipts, internal corporate emails, and high-fidelity audio files. The countdown in my head began, 60 seconds to dismantle a lifetime of lies. 0:05 seconds. The massive high-definition projector screen directly behind my parents on the studio stage flickered violently, the colorful, sanitized Children's Hospital logo spinning into a vortex of digital noise. The floor manager's headset began buzzing with high-pitched, panicked orders from the director's booth. "What's happening to the feed? Cut the transmission. Go to black, go to anything," he screamed, his face flushing a bright, panicked red as he gestured frantically to the camera operators. But the automated cameras remained locked in place, their internal tracking systems frozen on the stage. 0:15 seconds. The projector screen stabilized, displaying a massive official document in bold, unformatted text. A copy of a sealed federal environmental indictment and an active containment order. The document clearly, undeniably detailed that my parents' highly publicized, multi-million-dollar donation to the Children's Hospital wasn't an act of charity at all. It was a court-ordered, legally mandated penalty designed to avoid immediate federal prison time. The text scrolled rapidly, highlighting the terrifying reality that their latest commercial residential development project had intentionally, systematically dumped thousands of gallons of carcinogenic construction solvents directly into the protected wetlands, feeding the town's primary drinking water reservoir. The names of the specific middle-class neighborhoods whose water supply had been compromised scrolled across the screen in bright, glowing red letters. 0:25 seconds. The low murmurs of judgment in the studio audience instantly froze, replaced by a sharp, collective intake of breath. The wealthy real estate investors and local business owners in the second and third rows leaned forward, their eyes widening in absolute horror as they recognized the specific parcel numbers of the contaminated land. They hadn't just bought homes there, they had invested their entire corporate capital into those developments. 0:30 seconds. Before Arthur or Beatrice could even comprehend the text flashing on the wall behind them, the audio feed on the live broadcast cut my mother's microphone entirely. In place of her voice, a crystal-clear, unedited audio recording began to blare through the studio's massive surround sound speakers and through every single television set in the county. It was Beatrice's exact voice, stripped of its gentle maternal modulation, captured by a hidden forensic microphone I had planted in their private home office just 3 nights ago. "Make sure the environmental inspectors take the cash bribe tonight, Arthur. If the local news finds out the soil under the new suburban housing development is completely toxic and contaminated, we'll be completely ruined. If anyone ever starts asking questions, we'll just dump the blame onto Maya's shell company and tell the press she managed the entire project behind our backs. No one will ever believe her anyway. She's nothing but a disappointment to this town." 0:35 seconds. My mother's face transformed on the live studio monitors. The perfect, symmetrical smile fractured into a grotesque mask of sheer terror. Her lips parted, her breath hitching audibly as her own cold, calculating voice echoed back at her through the rafters, exposing her absolute malice to the very community she had claimed to protect. Arthur's aristocratic composure shattered. His hand flew to his necktie, pulling at it frantically as if the silk fabric were suddenly cutting off his oxygen supply. 0:40 seconds. The digital screen shifted again, bringing up a series of internal corporate emails between Arthur and their head financial accountant. The text outlined a deliberate, calculated strategy to falsify the structural integrity and fire safety certificates for the recent Oak Ridge Elementary School renovation project. The emails explicitly proved that they had used substandard, cheap construction materials to pocket over $2 million in excess municipal grant funding, leaving the town's children inside a hazardous structure. 0:45 seconds. The graphics transitioned to a series of verified offshore bank account ledgers from the tracking servers in the Cayman Islands. The documents highlighted an intricate, undeniable web of illegal wire transfers, showing exactly $6.8 million being moved directly out of the town's public infrastructure, road repair and emergency response funds. Money the hardworking townspeople had paid in taxes, straight into Arthur and Beatrice's private, hidden asset accounts to fund their private jet charters and international vacations. The matching digital bank timestamps left absolutely no room for legal deniability. 50 seconds. The names of 3 specific local city council members who had accepted consulting fees from these identical offshore accounts flashed on the screen in high-contrast text. In the VIP section of the studio audience, a prominent local politician slowly lowered his head into his trembling hands, his face turning completely white as his colleagues moved away from him as if he were contagious. 55 seconds. The broadcast feed pulled up the high-resolution signature pages of the fraudulent corporate bank accounts. Underneath the printed name Maya Sterling, the system displayed an official forensic handwriting analysis report from an independent digital examiner. The report conclusively proved that the signatures were perfect digital clones, created by Arthur's executive assistant, using a specialized tracing stylus tool on an administrative tablet. 1:00 minute. The final slide on the live broadcast split into 2 clear, high-contrast images. On the left side was a verified snapshot of my personal bank account balance, showing exactly $142. On the right side was the ultimate smoking gun. A heavily forged, illegally notarized power of attorney document where my parents had systematically, over a period of 3 years, drained the multi-million-dollar trust fund left directly to me by my late grandmother. They had used my stolen inheritance to fund their luxury vehicles, their designer wardrobes, and the very mansion they stood in, while leaving me to freeze in a broken apartment. The entire studio went dead, suffocatingly silent. The veteran news anchor froze completely solid in his leather chair, his mouth hanging wide open as he stared in absolute, unscripted horror at the projector screen behind them. His hands shook so violently that the physical cue cards he was holding slipped through his fingers, scattering across the polished mahogany desk. The studio cameras, still governed by the automated system script, remained locked on the stage, broadcasting every single line of sweat, every panicked twitch, and every ghostly expression on my parents' faces to every single household in the county. Arthur's face underwent a terrifying physical transformation. The smug, aristocratic tan faded into a sickly mottled shade of deep purple as his blood pressure spiked. His breath came in ragged, desperate wheezes that caught on his still-active lapel microphone, sounding like a dying machine over the high-fidelity speakers. Beatrice let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. She looked around the room frantically, her gaze sweeping across the audience, searching for a single friendly face, a single ally, a single person who would stand up to defend her. But she found absolutely nothing. The town stopped believing them in exactly 60 seconds. The low, buzzing whispers in the audience instantly exploded into shouts of raw fury and profound disgust. Mrs. Gable stood up from her seat, her face twisted in shock and betrayal, pointing a trembling finger at the stage. The local business owners who had lost their life savings investing in the contaminated commercial developments stood up, screaming across the studio floor, demanding their money back. The polished, glittering illusion of the Sterling family name was shattered into a million jagged, irrecoverable pieces right before their eyes. I locked eyes with my mother one last time across the screaming, chaotic room. She looked so small now, stripped of the grand stage, the fake narrative, and the corporate armor she had spent decades constructing at the expense of my life. The diamonds around her neck no longer looked like symbols of royalty. They looked like cold, heavy glass chains dragging her down into the abyss. I didn't say a single word to her. I didn't need to engage in a dramatic confrontation or explain the mechanics of my victory. The truth had done the work for me. I simply slipped my smartphone back into my coat pocket, turned away from the shouting crowd and the collapsing stage, and began walking calmly down the center aisle toward the studio's heavy exit doors. As the soundproofed doors swung open, the first distant, wailing sound of police sirens began to slice through the cold winter night outside, their flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the snow-covered pavement as they sped directly toward the studio complex. My parents had stood on a live broadcast and called me a disappointment to thousands of people, but as the heavy doors closed behind me and I stepped out into the clean, crisp, freezing air, I pulled my collar up and smiled. Their reign of terror was officially over, the truth was finally out, and my life was finally completely my own.